Hey everyone, Matt from Lawrence Systems here. Hoping you're having a good day so far. I think it's just to get a little bit better. I got two special folks here with me today. We've got Brandon. I can't talk today. I'm going entirely too fast. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to mellow things out a little bit. We've got Brendan here from Twingate, and of course, Mr. Tom Lawrence from Lawrence Systems. How you guys doing today?
Fantastic.
Great.
Man, I see that you've slowed down too. I'm happy. I had to hit the little turbo button and just kind of bring it down from 100 megahertz to 66. Doing pretty well now. So today we're here to talk about zero trust. It's a conversation that we've had several times. It's a conversation that I think happens within the MSP community quite a bit. And I think it's one that doesn't happen with enough clarity. Quite often, there are a lot of concepts get thrown around, a lot of terminology gets tossed around, and it all gets mixed up and becomes a big foggy mess. And we're here to bring a little clarity to that today. Kind of like OxyClean in the big bowl of iodine when they'd swirl around. That's what we're here to do today. So first, guys, I'd like to get a definition from you to use as a baseline of what ZTNA is today, so that we can continue answering questions based on that baseline.
Cool. I think, I'll take a stab at it. Like the most succinct I can make it, I think, is to never trust any connection and always verify every connection is what I would, I think, summarize ZTNA at, right? But it's more of an ideal, I think. So the implementation and getting there, that's why I think people get confused. It just becomes messy quickly, I think.
And I kind of like the NIST variation. That's what I tried to start with. And, to keep it simple, I mean, NIST has got a long document on this, but it's the evolving set of cybersecurity paradigms that move defenses from static network-based perimeters to focus on users, assets, and resources. And it's the idea, everything's becoming much more identity centric. So just because you're inside the firewall, and the fun movie cliche, we broke through the firewall, that doesn't mean you get access to everything. There's still more verifications and things that need to be done to confirm that this user has access to that resource. Well, there's always the snarky comments I see everywhere where people, it means I trust nothing, zero trust. I'm like, maybe, but I don't know. I can't control what the definitions are used in the market, because somehow the people that market things have agreed on this. And NIST is, I get that. I don't know a better term to use. So zero trust seems like a good way to start it out.
I think that zero trust works. I think that I equate it to a disallow rule in a firewall. You start off with a disallow rule, and then you have exceptions based on, say, maybe the source IP or the port or service you're trying to access. And of course, that is an oversimplification of things, but I think it's a good place to start. I don't trust you until I trust you. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
Nice.
The default position. Yeah. I like that.
I had to talk with both of you guys for at least 6 months before I'd say hello. I mean, that's exactly what ZTAN is, right? No, of course not. But that gets into misconceptions. What do you think, Brendan, I'll start with you. What do you think is the largest misconception regarding zero trust implementations? Not just zero trust as a concept, but the implementation process.
I think the two misconceptions I see in the field all the time is that one, it's going to get in the way of users. And that's like number one fear for people that gravitate towards zero trust. Those interests, it makes logical sense in the world we live in. But if you pivot your mentality to no one's going to have access to anything by default, and then you have to restore access on a case-by-case basis, you're going to alienate your end users. That's going to create more problems for you, and no one wants to create that negative experience, because usually you get only one shot at this. I think that's one. The second one is, I think there's still a category of people out there wanting to go towards zero trust and not really connecting the dots of how they're going to get there, how they're going to collect the data, who needs access to what endpoints across the entire infrastructure, across all applications. That seems to come up very rarely, actually, like early on when people are considering going for zero trust. Very interesting to me.
Zero trust is easy for new startups if they think this way in the beginning. It's a lot harder with legacy, because the first challenge is know thyself. And for IT people, they usually jump right to, know all the hosts on the network, know all the network switches, know all the devices, etc. But it's a lot more than that. It's knowing the application level and knowing what applications are important to what users. And that can be a little bit harder to tackle. You start looking at just how many different applications there are for a larger enterprise. It's like, that's a lot to get a handle on, and making sure that who has well granular and delegated access to those things has been documented somewhere. So it's a lot of documentation up front is the implementation before you get to implementation or figuring out what product to use or any of that stuff, is just making sure you understand all those connections and building that whole matrix of these users and resources, and this matrix breaks that down. So we go, oh, these people only need this. And it goes back to some of the long standing years ago stated principles of least privilege. Like, that's not a new concept. We were in the pre-show, we were talking about, I had just reread Kevin Mitnick's book on the art of intrusion, but he comes down, the whole last chapter is how to mitigate all these things. And it all starts with principles of least privilege. When you really apply that to the application level, then you're really getting zero trust. Do they need access to those things? Now, the CEO will argue with you all day. Apparently they need access to everything. And usually the people that need the least amount of access, they don't need the details. They're making decisions at a high level. So sometimes you got to pull it from the C-suite that maybe they shouldn't have access to everything. Sometimes those are the same people that click on things.
Man,
you give me flashbacks.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I worked early in my career. I worked for a company that sold automation software, and no least privilege access back then. We all worked in an office, and I realized that relatively quickly when I started, I had access to the Exchange server. And then we started messing around because we worked professional services. We had a lot of free time, and we realized we could send emails on behalf of other people. And then we realized we could actually check the password policy for each account against the Exchange server. And we realized the only employee at that company whose password never expired was the CEO.
Boss.
Yeah, like, you're the main target. Like, the threat model is higher for the CEO than it is for me, an individual contributor. And the exception never made sense to me.
Well, it's, the CEO's got the target on their back, and that CEO had a target with a neon sign letting everyone know where the target is. Hey, right here,
exactly.
right
never
here.
Changing that password. Yeah, exactly.
Goodness, we can't have something like that. Now, I got a question for you guys. It has nothing to do with what's on the questions that have come in, just because it's been on my mind a little bit, and I think it's actually worth it. It gets into marketing a little bit, but not selling of services. The Twingate name, I always assumed that had to do with the Golden Gate Bridge. And then I learned that it was actually about gating, like keep preventing people from gaining access. And I was hoping that maybe you can give an analogy for that, because I sense that that'll help people in clear up in their minds as well, because I know I've used a couple of analogies with like space travel with people on your team. And now I'm thinking a submarine, the way a submarine is kind of like sectioned off.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. It's two different sort of gates that you have to pass. You can't go through anything if you don't pass both gates, and both gates are completely independent. You have a gate that's with you on the device, right? On your client, like where you're connecting physically. That technically, if you were really, really smart and you were really, really technical, maybe you could do something with that if you had the wrong intentions. But that's why there's a second gate that's not within your control at all. That's not on your device. It's a control infrastructure, basically, that verifies the authenticity of your client, of the connection on the back end, and all of the permissions as well. So it gets checked against two separate entities, one that is very much with the device and the user, and one that is not. That's where Twingate came from.
Okay. See, again, I didn't want to approach marketing of Twingate. I don't want to try and sell anything, but I feel like that the name itself got me thinking about that. And it helped kind of solidify in my mind a visualization of how I look at zero trust. And that makes it a little bit easier for me to understand. So if anyone else sees that and they get that, Twingate, not Twingate, doesn't matter. The fact is you learn something from that. Now, I know there's a question that we received that you really kind of wanted to get into, and it's still in the fundamentals. So I think we should go into that before jumping onto another section. And that's, what are the most common initial roadblocks organizations face? We talked about the CEO and the CEO wanting access to everything. Are there other, say, business units like business services, human resources, finance, that are a common roadblock for the implementation of ZFS? We love ZFS, of zero trust.
Zero trust.
Or is it kind of like a blanketed kind of set of roadblocks that exist in almost equity across an organization? Or are there particular areas that you have to kind of be aware of and maybe attack head on?
So, man, but there's a lot in there. I think number one roadblock is that people don't put a price tag of value on zero trust if they've never had a breach, right? It's like
Yeah.
paying for insurance and never using your insurance. It feels like it's a cost, and you don't really feel the value of it until you really, really need it, but then it's too late. I think that's one. And so some people that have been part of breaches in the past to the particularly security conscious, they'll advocate as to why it's important to just think of security and ZTNA as a starting paradigm, not something that you want to bolt on for some type of artificial reasons. I think that's the main roadblock. The second one is more practical, but it doesn't really it doesn't interfere with companies' willingness to go towards zero trust. It's just a implementation, what Tom was talking about with a matrix of permissions. Putting that together, that's a bit of a roadblock, but more so to the implementation than it is to the willingness towards better security in a zero trust model, I think.
Interesting. I don't do the hands-on work anymore. Now I'm listening to this. It's getting me antsy. I want to do a little bit of this. I'm getting a little anxious about zero trust itself. And a question a lot of people are going to ask, especially since the pandemic, let's say the past 5 or 6 years, is what's the difference between traditional perimeter security and what we've got today? And I think the answer to that is that the perimeter does not exist in the way that it used to. So I think that's a very easy question that I just answered. I want to take it a step further and understand how something like zero trust applies to cloud environments where there never really was a perimeter.
Right. Yeah.
Is it easier in that situation, or is it we had a perimeter, we know what we were doing here, we knew how to modify our approach to it, but those guardrails are gone in the cloud? Because I could see that as being a potential issue.
Yeah, it's worse. You have, I like to think of it as just like a sort of bubbles of exposure, right? Your surface area used to be maybe your perimeter, right? Your office, your data center, maybe it's combined. And now you have people working from home, and you have people working from coffee shops, right? They're their own little bubble of exposure because they're exposed to the internet. You don't know what they're outbound. You don't know what they're inbound in their own network, let alone your Starbucks in the corner. And then you add on cloud providers that each have their own paradigms, their own concepts, their own training material, their own expertise, their own certifications. And so the more you add to your environment in terms of how complex and sort of diversified it is, the more you have to have that like super horizontal expertise across all of those things. But we're all fallible, right? Like we all make mistakes. So if you end up having to configure multiple cloud providers in the most secure way, but also your data center and office in the most secure way, you're much more likely to make mistakes than if you just had one perimeter to protect. And you expose yourself to many more attack vectors. So cloud's great, but cloud just increases your surface area of exposure for sure.
It used to always require someone be in the office. And then we started, building dial-in systems. I know they've existed for a long time, but they became more popular through the 90s and early 2000s. And once everyone was connected, we had VPNs. And that is where still people stopped right there. Is they just said, okay, I went from dial up to VPN. That's as modern as I need to get. And from the early 2000s to 2025, a lot has changed. And there's always this assumption once you're in the inside of the VPN, you have access to all the company resources, you've validated that person. So the term frequently used is identity is a new perimeter, but the old perimeter still exists. We don't do away with firewalls. We still have to separate outside from in. This is just another layer and modernizing security to match what things look like here in 2025, because I really focus on that identity, and then that's how the cloud identifies you. When you log in, are you just logging in because you have access, because it knows the position you are on the network, or maybe you're just filtering by IP, or you really want to go, hey, let's make sure the cloud is using some type of credentials that maybe have some attestation that say this person is allowed to access that resource. So as you move it to that way, the inconsistency challenge right now is that there's not one way to access some of the cloud applications. So we're getting better with SAML, OAuth, et cetera, and the extensibility we have in modern ways to authenticate things. But sometimes the cloud companies are less than modern. They may be modern in their app, but they
less than compliant with the standards.
and oh yeah, by the way, I guess we got to deal with identity.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about identity now and the cloud. So that leads to a question that's actually in the same group that I put together here. And I want to ask, does zero trust in any way address the security of APIs for, say, cloud-based services?
You can. It really depends. I mean, if you're filtering, instead of just saying we're just going to use across the open internet anywhere, you want to filter and have rules that say this resource can use this API from this, whether that this is a IP address, this is
Network, whatever.
a network, a tunnel set up. You can limit in scope where that API is accessible. That's definitely can be part of the path to getting there, where that way if someone were to steal that API, and easy, stupid little example, there's a little thing sitting behind me that does a YouTube count, and that requires API access to the YouTube API to pull from Google, but it is filtered to my IP address. So if someone were to get the key because accidentally I exposed it on a live stream when showing people how it worked,
Oops.
then someone would find out that, hey, it doesn't work unless I have Tom's IP address. So
Hey, well, you know,
I did roll the key. That problem's been solved, but I accidentally forgot where, because that is not well put together code. As in, Tom doesn't code, so sometimes Tom may have embedded an API key in the code.
But that's exactly it, right there. That's a user problem. Those things happen.
Completely a Tom problem.
Right?
I did not post my code on GitHub because I tried putting it externally. It didn't work. It's that testing phase of it didn't work externally. I put it in the code. Hey, look, it works. I'll fix that later. Oh, look, it works. So. Yeah, because they have restrictions on that API. It's narrow in scope what it can access, which is read-only access to my YouTube channel for account, and restricted by IP. But you can do those same things. That really helps to blast radius. And when something happens, the thing that happened. Someone got in, someone lifted something, but you really want to eliminate the blast radius by restricting what they can or cannot do.
Yeah, I'll add that, like, when it comes to securing API communications, it does create it's machine to machine, so it's a little bit different, but a machine's still it's a non-human identity. Like, there's a startup that I saw at RSA last time I attended that specializes on non-human identities. I think that's how they brand themselves, actually. And it was interesting because since then we've seen more and more companies with use cases that are they're working on infrastructure that's distributed, right? Think you're a company building mobile apps. You're going to want to test your mobile apps really, really well across lots of different mobile devices. So there's companies out there that actually do that work for you, but those mobile devices are going to be somewhat automated and have to connect to APIs that you may maintain that might not be production ready, therefore might actually have vulnerabilities that you haven't tested for yet, but you want to run functional testing. You should secure those communications between those testing of devices and your API endpoints that may or may not be production ready, right? So it's very much a first-class citizen as well, because if it's exposed, it will get exploited. Like, I used to give this example all the time prior to going to Twingate. I used to have a VPN server at my house, right? No one cares about my home lab. I have pictures of my kid, and that's pretty much all I have, so that my family and friends can see them. But still, with that one port open, I think I used OpenVPN back then, I used to look at how many times something would try to break through that port.
Oh, absolutely.
It was anywhere between 30 and 60 times a day. No one cares about my home lab, but because it's open, it can be automated against, and that's a problem.
It's like cartoons, man. You see a cartoon house with the pie out the window, you're going to want to try and get to it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's a good write-up, and this is a video I'm working on actively right now. There's a write-up call on the Huntress blog about the Foundation server, which is an accounting software used by construction industries. And we had a new client we were onboarding, and that's what got popped was the Foundation server. It was on our project list to have that port eventually move behind a VPN, but as they had it previously set up, and it would have been disruptive, that's why it's a process to get you to zero trust, where we say, hey, everyone's phone should have a VPN on it that allows them access. That's a project. We put a pin in it and said, that's a project we're going to get to. We're going to get you onboarded. We're going to get your security software on there. And they had a lot of other legacy things that need to be fixed, because it's not one thing. That's always the challenge with clients. There's a lot of things, but coming back to it, in between, after onboarding our tooling, but before a project complete of getting them to a VPN on every phone, someone access that server? Who wants to access some accounting software by them? Well, it turns out there's a really interesting privilege escalation that can be done that takes you from logging into the accounting server to instantly pivoting to system credentials on an Active Directory, and lets them pop a shell that runs commands that can then pivot throughout the rest of the network. Now, a good thing is the security tooling caught this. It was they watched them run a couple SQL commands that looked suspicious, and then he's seen the shell, and then et cetera. And well, it got stopped. But it's one of those things, getting them to that zero trust is important, but it's that you didn't expect it. It's just some accounting software that's got a port open, and it is extremely used in the industry. It is a really big, popular software. If you're in the construction business, there's a very strong likelihood they're the dominant player for this. So this is exposed all over the place, and this is how a lot of people find out that the way the company set up the software, there's a way in. Wasn't for a long time. Software's been around for a long time, but when someone found that way in, more and more people have been finding that way in, and they're doing it with automated tools now.
I'm just going to put this out there as a blanket statement. I think it's a good one to make. It's a little bit of paranoia, but that's kind of par for the course for accounting systems. Unfortunately, they tend to take a long time to be updated in many situations, and those things will sit. I had that many years ago, using tools from many different companies, and that was a big deal, and always had to make sure that I think we had nothing against Blackbaud. I think they had a great product in Razor's Edge and Financial Edge, but we used to keep that on a separate network and have IPsec communications between, I think, subnets because of potential risks and because of how long it would take to get certain things upgraded. And that, I guess you could look at it as an early form of zero trust, having to isolate a device on its own subnet in the network just to make sure that no one's going to get to it because of those potential risks. Now,
you only do that if you know, right? If you know it's a risk.
Yeah,
there's
you have
legacy
to be aware of
stuff you don't even know that can be exploited. I just came across you guys know about WPAD, like web proxy, the Active Directory technology that's baked into like Windows domain controllers. You can exploit that like really easily just for the purpose of discovery and like figuring out what's on the network. And most companies that we see actually still have that activated. And then you go to them and you say, do you guys actually use that? And the answer is, oh yeah, actually, no, we don't. We've never disabled it, but it's not being used.
We didn't even know it was there. Yeah,
exactly. And we didn't know there was a vulnerability, or we didn't know it could be exploited. So it still takes that consciousness to want to be focused on security to like even look at whether something should be deactivated or not.
And well, that also gets back to looking at different security frameworks. Awareness is usually the first thing in most frameworks, right? I think CSF, right? That's the first thing, is you have to be aware of your environment. You cannot protect what you don't know exists. Now, we've just gone over like 25 years of remote access just now, talking about different methods. And I've had my RAS server back here, and it's the same thing, point-to-point tunneling protocol. Used to always see activity on that port back in the day. And I want to take us into the future. You know what's going to happen, right? What makes everything better? Come on, you guys know it. It's only two letters.
I mean, AI is where you're getting at, I assume?
No. BS, barbecue sauce. One of the questions that came in, oh man, now I'm getting hungry. How do you see zero trust evolving with the rise of AI and machine learning?
I mean, I think there's two things. We started thinking about that a lot recently. I think it's as vendors, as providers of zero trust, it's going to help us, I think, deliver faster insight, more insight to people, and be more proactive about what they should look at next, right? Like, again, back to that problem of like going to zero trust if you came from VPN is kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, right? And so you have to know what you're looking for. You have to spend a lot of time sifting through data to understand who needs access to what, is it legitimate, what are they doing with that technology and all that. I think AI is going to help us kind of provide the proactive insights to people. Now, it's going to create, I guess that's the positive. The negative is that it's just going to create, I think, this world where AI agents are going to start taking actions on behalf of their human counterpart, right? I started using AI for what I do at Twingate as a productivity tool, but I can tell when MCPs become commonplace, I will start delegating stuff to that agent. But it'll start accessing production systems perhaps that have access to. So now we have to deal with yet another category of users that are AI-based users that AI is still a black box. So you also don't really know how it operates, decisions it makes, and how it chooses to do things. That's super scary. And I think that there's no other choice but to go into sort of the world of democratizing privileged access on top of zero trust. You're going to have to start looking at not what entities are accessing what, but what entities are doing with those endpoints systematically, auditing all of that, logging all of that. And I think that's the reality we're going to live in
It's
when it comes
like
to zero trust.
comparing resources and responsibility in order to gain access.
Yeah.
Nice.
And coming back to some of the AI stuff, because it's a non-deterministic system, the exact same input will not always yield the exact same output. It brings its own challenges on there, especially when you're feeding it as a MCP. And then exactly like you had said, the MCP now has to have its own set of credentials and logging and auditing of that to make sure it doesn't do anything bad. But I also think there's going to be a really big play here for self-hosted systems, because we just can't always trust our users as much as we'd like to use these things in a secure way where they're not feeding company secrets that are potentially leaked out there. Recently Facebook has been in the news for the wrong reasons, or just typical behavior of them, of exposing users' data that they said they wouldn't. And these companies have lost faith for good reason in these large companies. And we have seen clients that we've worked with to decide to host their own internal AI. And it's not that hard to do, because that way it's always within the company. So this comes back to, how do you delegate access to it? Well, it's another resource. We figured out who needs access to it. We self-host it, so the data can never, if they accidentally put things they aren't supposed to, or we're told not to put in there, the risk is minimal because we've self-hosted it. Self-hosting's more reasonable than people think, and it doesn't mean it's only the Fortune 500 companies.
I've got 3 LLM hosts in this room right now running.
Well, exactly. We have one at work. It's because we give it to our salespeople and allowing them to do it. We're never worried about what our salespeople are putting in, because they're putting in a system we have control over. So if they put things they weren't told in there, we have control over it. It's not we got to let customers know we may have exposed some data. Not an issue for us, if one of these LLMs. But that comes back to, how do you get those resources in? How do you build zero trust around there? It's the same thing. It's part of that matrix. Who's going to have access? All right, sales team, checkbox. They have access in this matrix. It says they're allowed to access the internally self-hosted LLM that gives us tighter controls over it. So it still all plays together. And I can imagine the iterations are happening fast in this. So eventually they're going to put something in, and then it's going to take an action, which is kind of cool too, to think about. Like, they're going to put this in, get this quote, send this quote over there, modify the quote. Maybe the LLMs get smart enough so they can do some of the sales negotiation. All right, client comes back with an alternative offer. How far do we let the LLM negotiate? We're getting theoretical here, but you could see all that playing out, and why you'd want to have tight controls around that for who accesses it when and how they do it.
Absolutely.
I do think that AI is going to also create this sort of like the consciousness you were talking about, right? And you have to be conscious of your environment and aware. I think using AI as a productivity tool more and more is going to erode this ability to stay aware of your environment, because it's a cognitive shortcut to information that sometimes, if you really want a complete picture of something, you have no other choice but to
do the work,
almost drown yourself in the noise to get the signal out of that. If you just use AI to sort out the signal, you will eventually miss something, and your understanding of things in your brain, the way you build a mental map of the world and your environment, will become more and more shallow, because you'll dump the rest into that second brain that's AI. And that's going to create more, I think, possibilities for an exploit to arise just from misconfiguration, because the AI missed it and you just didn't know how it worked. You didn't know enough about it that it just stays open, and someone figured it out. That's also going to be a problem, I think.
Well, exactly. And it also comes down to trusting the AI because of the way their predictive models are designed to please us in a way. It's too easy to trust that. There's always going to have to be that manual process that takes place. Now, we're here on the Business Technicalities channel. It's part of Lawrence Systems. And I would be remiss if we had a stream like this where we talked about things and we didn't talk about Home Lab. I think Home Lab's a requirement, it's an expectation, and it's one we have to meet. We had a whole bunch of questions from Home Lab in class. In fact, questions 26 to 40 on the document that was compiled is all Home Lab based. We're not going to hit all of those, but I think there are a couple that we should go for. There's a question here about low-cost tools and services that could be used to build a basic zero trust setup at home. And I think there are a ton of services out there. I know that Twingate has home lab focused items. I'm going to ask you to talk about that in a minute, because that is a free service that I think needs to be talked about. But I do want to mention that, you know, there are a lot of open source options out there, and I think it's very much worth looking at. Look at what independent projects are putting out. Look at what commercial projects are out there from companies like Twingate, because there are a ton of options. And just as there are a ton of options, there are a ton of use cases, and you want to find something that works for you. But with that said, please, I want you to give the spiel on what's available from you guys for home labbers, because that's important.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I started, right? That's how I found myself into Twingate, because at some point I have a home lab, like I said before. It's like, I don't know, moderate in terms of sophistication. I have people on my team that have networks that are crazy and way over engineered, which is wonderful in itself. It's a good way to experiment.
But real quick, I've never worked with anyone with an over engineered home lab.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's the fun. Like when you can see multiple Wi-Fi's and you can tell they're segmented, you know, you're in the right household. You know, and so I just wanted to something a little bit more robust. And I started Googling, right? Like what can I do to actually not do any open port forwarding? I don't want to do port forward. And I just stumbled across Twingate, and it turns out that Twingate had a free tier. You know, and the thing that I thought was really, really cool is that I like to, when I evaluated new technology, I did the same thing when I invested in my first NAS, which was a Synology back like 15 years ago.
Okay.
I want to see that those APIs, I want to see that I'm going to be able to customize them, really get under the hood. And I created a free Twingate account. Like today, it's still free for 5 users or less. It's very, I would argue Twingate is probably the easiest solution out there to implement when you want to do zero trust at your house, because you really only have one thing to install on your device and one thing to install in your network, and you're done. That's all you need to do. It's very, very simple. But I contacted support back then, even though I wasn't like just a free user, right? It's at random to try to get an API key to play with their API. And I wasn't expecting any response. And I got an immediate response from support that gave me an API key for my account. And I thought, man, okay, those guys get it, because they're doing this thing that is making, even though I'm a free user, that's making me feel special by providing a high quality solution that's really easy to implement, and by listening to me, a technical person, wanting to talk to a technical person. And that's why I fell in love with Twingate. And that's why I actually tried to join after that, right? I wanted to live and breathe this sort of like, the motto of my organization is that we want to provide an uncommonly delightful experience to everyone, whether they pay for Twingate or they don't pay for Twingate. And I think that's what we're doing. That's why we have a subreddit and all that now.
Yeah.
But I would say that if you want to get to zero trust and you want to really start looking at who's connecting to what in your household, outside of it as well, and restrict permissions without getting into the way of your users, take a look at Twingate, install it, it's free, and then come hit us up on our subreddit. Actually, I'm in there all the time. My staff's there all the time responding to questions. I also do a weekly onboarding. Actually, it's bi-weekly now. Every 2 weeks, I answer technical questions on Wednesday, like literally at 11 Pacific. I love doing that stuff. It's one of my passion projects at Twingate.
Answering questions and talking to people that are technically inclined is fun. And that's why I wanted to take the time to make sure people knew about the Twingate offering.
You're engaged with the community. So like this, we posted the Reddit link there. But I'll also go a little further with the home lab stuff. When you start the home lab, you start building a few things. The frequent question I get as someone who talks to a lot of the home lab community is, hey, I want to access this home lab remotely. So they want to open ports. And I really, really try to slap their hand on that one, especially if you're new and not certain. A consulting project I've worked on, someone, and they've learned, and we've coached them through what they had and built it. They actually moved it from home lab to business, and they just had everything open, but they don't have any plans to update things. I'm like, yeah, no, this is not the way to do it. Moving yourself to a better security posture at your home lab is just as important, because you spend a lot of time doing it, and you don't want to accidentally expose things that put you at risk, especially if you have a lot of personal family things on their photos, etc. So putting a VPN on it, putting an overlay style network like Twingate where you're not opening ports, puts you at a better security posture. Now, if you want to open ports later to host things, I encourage that. We have an entire video on how to host things with, in the cloud, or using things like Pangolin to relay it, things like that. That's fine.
You mean like putting pangolin on a Raspberry Pi that's hanging here on a
Right.
stereo connection.
There's fun things you can do like that, but in the short term, your simplest path to remote access, especially, photo apps are all the rage because we don't want our photos given to insert name of large company that would love to exploit us for our data.
Yeah.
We want to be able to connect it. And so you load the app on your phone that allows you to connect to your home lab, or you're traveling, you want to get to whatever things you have. But that's a real important piece of it, is especially when you are new in the security, don't open any ports. Use something like Twingate, as we're giving an example in here, to where it handles that security part for you. So you still have the convenience of access without the potential inconvenience of getting owned.
Well, you know what it's like having a nice breeze in your home without leaving the windows open. I think of open ports in a firewall as the same thing as leaving the window open. Someone can just crawl right in, hang out, start watching HBO. I don't want that.
Yep.
We want to make sure that our windows are positioned in a way that's not easy to get to. They're locked properly, yet we're allowing air through for that breeze.
The analogy I give people is that, like, with something like Twingate, you just remove the doors and windows. Like, there's no visible entry point to, like, if you are an attacker to start from, there's no URL, there's no port to go and try to probe and see what it responds with, send credentials to and see what happens. There's just nothing. So you don't get to see the door or the window,
So then let's
the one thing I wanted to add is also, I'm sure everyone that's listening to this is, like, relatively technical, but I don't want people to come away with the impression that you have to be super technical to implement a solution like that and better security. Like, I think the security works really well when you implement it. It's intuitive enough that you understand the model. You don't have to do a lot of technical work. You don't have to spend hours understanding how the platform works. Because if you pick a solution that's overly technical and not intuitive, you are bound to making mistakes, and those mistakes can
be many moving parts.
Costly. Yeah, exactly. Run to misconfigurations now.
And bonus, if you're behind CGNAT, now you solve that problem too. That's right. Becoming common for people in rural areas, people that travel using Starlink or whatever remote access internet. CGNAT, IPv4 exhaustion is a thing.
Yeah, very true.
All right, guys, we're here at 1:08. So we got a little time. I'm going through this document. I can't tell you, there's so many great things here. I didn't look at these too far ahead because I wanted to do this on the fly. And okay, this is a good one that I'd love to know. The former IT director in me is kind of looking at this. My ears starting to tingle, which means I need to know about it. How do I handle device posture assessment and compliance in zero trust models?
There's no one answer that satisfies every organization. I think for this, like every time we're being asked about best practices, I think I always go back to what's your threat model? Like, what are you protecting against, right? I had a fascinating discussion maybe about 2 months ago at a dinner with a former CISO that worked at Google and Microsoft. And we were talking about Signal back then, right? I said, it's when the government was caught using Signal and stuff like that. I was asking him, what do you think of Signal as an app, the style of encryption they have, like the fact that it's open source? And he looked at me and he said to me, you have to think about your threat model, because in reality, Signal could be built in a perfect way with privacy in mind and open source everything that everyone can see what it does. If someone or an entity was to just modify the host operating system it's running on to take screenshots, then your encryption doesn't matter at all. Like, it doesn't matter that your messages are encrypted. And so I always now go back to this threat model. And so that's what I'll talk to customers and prospects about. What is it that you're trying to guard against? In most cases, if it's companies that are starting their journey, and often they'll already have something, if they're big enough, they'll have like a CrowdStrike, a SentinelOne, or something like that, right? And so we'll just ask questions around what kind of behavior are you trying to guard against? And then the mitigation dictates, the control dictates that kind of mitigation. If it's a smaller company that hasn't figured it out yet, right? They started building their applications, they cut corners, used a VPN, didn't do any device verification, device posture checks, and all that, then the baseline is to start with just only allowing devices that you are aware of. Back to the awareness point you made earlier. Start with that very simple thing. Credentials are no longer enough. MFA is no longer enough. Make sure The device that's connecting from the right user is a device that you actually know of and you have actually pre-approved. I would say that's like the very baseline, the very first. You're getting into this, do this in the first 50 minutes, and then add and bolt on controls over that, depending on your threat model. You know.
Yeah, I've long said BYOD stands for bring your own disaster. I have never been a fan of just letting whoever bring their own laptops, especially those laptops. This has been a challenge. You know, we work with a lot of transportation companies, and generally we'll just say that they're of low business maturity frequently. And so they want to share the laptop with the kids that they also use to work from home. And I'm like, no, has to be separate device. And over the years, technology has really plummeted in terms of cost. A laptop's not an expensive device like it used to be. So just having an extra one, people kind of fought me on this. Our clients did, but I said, look, I can't let you use the whatever device. It's going to have to be locked down. You're not going to have admin privileges. And you can't really trust that as well. So you want to maintain that device has been something that is secured to the standard that you have, and that you can't just let anyone just go load software on something and get connected to company resources. Because much like to the point that the Google guy made, what if someone, you know, you've done all the right things, but if they load this on a compromised device that doesn't have the proper security posture because it has something else loaded, that becomes the point at which they get in because you've validated it. So you got to make sure all those controls are on that device. Hence the BYOD is bring your own disaster, and I don't let people bring disasters into my network.
I like that.
Yeah.
I've got a question here, and this is coming from the perspective of the typical SMB owner. This was asked by an MSP owner, asking how Zero Trust can help protect businesses from ransomware attacks. I think that it sounds like a very simple thing to answer, but I think if we answer it very clearly, that'll be helpful to a lot of people that have to explain that to small business owners. How can something like Zero Trust help protect a business from ransomware attacks?
I would say a lot of the times when you break down, and I love reading, there is a website called the Differ Report, and they walk through publicly available Differ reports to walk you through from ingress to, you know, those initial actions all the way to the end in the disaster that hit them with ransomware events. But you find out that someone impersonated a user is pretty much common, whether it be from phishing, from whatever. So not having those users have as much privilege where you've zero trusted it out, because why should someone get a phishing email at the most base level? There was, I think one was a city, and this person's like, you know, the basic, they answer the phone at the city, their secretary position. They had full access to all the network resources, and that was the pivot point by which they were able to accelerate through the network and get to all the resources off of this one person who had more privilege than they should. So it comes back to something we talked about earlier, is understanding in that matrix of what people should or shouldn't have access to and identifying all those resources. You know, there's a side bonus that comes from identifying the resources too. When you walk someone through a tabletop of their disaster recovery plan, one of the questions that no one likes is what's critical. And the first answer is everything. And no, it's not. No, it's not. What can't you live without? Because we need to create a tiered list of how fast we're going to restore it. We are a limited team. If you go through a disaster, it could happen. So the tabletop starts with what's your critical components? What am I going to restore first? Because everyone says everything, but everything's not the right answer. You have to walk me through that. And that's all part of that same matrix that comes out of that. So you understand what is really important to your company, what is important to keep your company at some level of function to not go out of business during some type of security event. So it can all be tied together as one larger thing. It's a big discussion with a client. So even with a small business, it might be even easier. They have less things they're usually doing. There's probably only about 20 things instead of 200 things they're accessing.
We're going to play a game real quick. This just came off the fly. This was not planned whatsoever. Little Mad Libs. I'm going to give you a phrase with a blank, and I'd like you guys to choose the right word. And whoever has the one that I deem better is going to get, I don't know, some prize from something in my room here. All right. So Zero Trust is role-based access control on blank. What's the blank?
It's role-based access control. Just looking for a single word to encapsulate it.
Yeah, let's go.
I mean, I want to say our back on crack because that just sounds funny.
Yeah, it's like, yeah.
See, now all you gotta do is beat
That's
crack
hard
and
to
you
top.
win. Just
That's
beat
hard
crack
to
and you
top because
win.
the rhyme is what kills it too.
That rhymes what made
It's
it.
gonna
It's
be
what
hard.
it
Yeah.
came in my head.
I can't come up with anything better than that. It is role-based access on crack. I love that.
That was a campaign in itself right there. I think,
Yeah.
gentlemen,
I
you're
just want
both
to see
gonna
the
get a
company
pin with
bold
me
enough
on
to
it.
use it in their marketing. We do our back on crack.
Oh man, that was.
We
that
had
was-
a
We'll see at the next RSA event or Black Hat event.
we had actually on at RSA a few years ago, we had made those T-shirts that said like your VPN is SH with a little star T. And it actually got a lot of traction. And then we had actually registered VPNsucks.com that rerouted to Twingate.com. Actually, I don't know if that's still live, but it seemed to
I
get
like
a
that.
lot of traction now. Yeah.
All right. I didn't know if that was going to go well or not. I wasn't expecting that. That was beautiful. It threw me off to the point where I don't even know what I want to ask you guys. Oh, yes, I do. This is an excellent question. This is going to come from a lot of people in home labs as well as managing other people's technology. How can I use virtualization? And in parentheses, I've got Proxmox, which is great. XCPNG is another option. Just because I like things in threes, ESXi, to facilitate zero trust experimentation.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. I mean,
Yeah.
with Proxmox, you can deploy pretty much anything you want, right? So with Proxmox, you could create, I mean, you could segment things pretty easily. I'm not a Proxmox user. I've actually never tried Proxmox myself, but a lot of my engineers have. Yeah, I hear it's fantastic. It's one of the things that's on my to-do list. So you could create like mini environments in a Proxmox server and then just like have a jumping point in those small environments to then just like play with. You have the equivalent of I don't want to call it a
It's
VPN gateway. We call it a connector between
essentially
you and
two networks, two subnets, and something in between.
yeah, exactly.
Them. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And then you define like roles that only map to maybe one server or one, like if you run like Homar, like Sonar, Radar, something like that to just specific roles in that subnet to see, like to verify that anyone else can in fact not access any of your environment. So it's always a good idea to experiment with it, I think.
That's actually a really great way to simulate. You got the separate networks internally on this individual machine that you're working with. Oh man, I'm gonna have to play with that now. I was trying to find ways to look at some different tools, given that I've been exposed to so many new things lately myself, and I love Proxmox. So Tom, please say something about XCPNG because I know you wanna.
But yeah, I use XCPNG, but it's the same concept as Proxmox. One of the things I've done, I've got a whole video where I break down how my lab is set up, and people think it's odd, but I have a whole CGNAT range. And what I do is I create series of virtual firewalls, and I just give them all CGNAT ranges. And then behind it, I have more hosts that are all created in the virtual environment. So first I'm handing out CGNAT ranges to firewalls and hosts behind it, but then you can simulate what the network looks like. And I threw Twingate on each side on different hosts. I wanted to see how they talk to each other. Because they're isolated, there's no lateral east-west. They have to go out to my simulated internet of CGNAT, and it kind of makes a way so I can really understand. And because I'm the one hosting all the firewalls, I dig into the, playing with some Wireshark. I want to know all the details. Give me some packet capture. I want to go deep and figure out what's going across the network. How is it doing this? How does NAT hairpin work with this particular tool? Yeah. So it gives you a lot of knowledge on how things work, so you have a better understanding of what it looks like in an environment. Because so much of what I do is just constant lab testing for things, and I want to poke at it. I want to see what happens when this happens, when I put this scenario together. And I love having the lab environment to spin it up, because once you've built it all out, building that for me is about a 10-minute adventure to spin up hosts, because I've got templates for the hosts. The firewalls are in place all the time, and I can split hosts just by changing the network they're attached to, of where they land on which different section of the network, and then watch the rules go in between.
That's super cool. That's got to be the best way to test like networking software.
Oh yeah.
Without having to deal with the noise of, like you said, east-west traffic. Actually, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that.
When they're the only host on a network, you don't have to spend a lot of time creating extra filters in your packet capture, because there's the only packets on those networks are the ones I put on there. And just out of habit, I'm usually using Debian hosts. And once they boot up, the only thing they do is check the Debian update server. So I can easily filter out. Other than that, they don't reach out. They only do that once in a while. So
that's super cool. I love that.
I got one more question that I want to ask, and then I'm going to see if there's anything that comes from the live audience. There's always going to be a technical question. I see we got a couple here, and I'd like to hit those because I think it fits into what we're doing here. But before that, there's a question here. How can I use a central identity provider in a home lab environment with respect to zero trust? Now I see Keycloak is being used here, and I've never heard of Keycloak myself. I would just think of like an open LDAP or something like that. I think would be the first thing that would come to mind. But are there considerations that you have to take when using an identity provider like that within a home lab or a small business environment when zero trust is involved?
I mean, I would say Keycloak's amazing for a home lab because first of all, you can self-host it. It's a very rare that you have an identity provider that you can self-host. So if you really want to experiment with it and not have your data anywhere, Keycloak is a perfect option. And I would say in general, if you really are serious about zero trust, it's like Tom said at the beginning, it's very much centered around the concept of identity. So you're not going to do zero trust without your perimeter becoming centered around the identity of your users and the identity of your systems. And so like in Twingate, for instance, you kind of have to have that concept of identity that actually lives outside of Twingate itself. And then each identity is assigned roles, and those roles is what determines what you actually have access to. So I would say experimenting with zero trust in a home lab, using Keycloak, is it overkill? 100%. But is it amazing because you get to play with new tech? And is it cool? Absolutely, yeah.
You just said, is it overkill? That makes it appropriate. Come on, it's the right audience. Overkill is just enough. Overkill is just enough.
Overkill is the only kill in the home lab. That's the way. That's the way to do it. But
Tom's a phrase machine today. What is this?
Learning how identity providers work is complicated but fun. And wrapping your head around it at first that there's a separate IDP, because it's not just username and password anymore. Once you dive into and get your head wrapped around all the authentication methods, how they work. I was at a conference early this year, and one of my favorite talks was an entire hour-long talk on nothing but how OAuth, SAML, and several things like all related, all tied together. And it was just such a good talk. It's the one I took the most notes on, because even this guy, this is a software developer conference. And he started out, he goes, I thought I knew this. Then I tried doing a talk on it, and it took me a year to put this together. He goes, what I thought I knew and what I know now are very different. And he goes, that's what made it come into a talk, is just the level of complexity that's involved, and making sure you understand how the different things do it, how session tokens are formed. And it made him better at understanding security when he starts writing an application of where those pain points are. And the fact that there's the ability to have really robust self-hostable IDP platforms, that's great. Now, you can play with them in your home lab and kind of overkill your way in there and figure out how you tie it all together.
I think there's a world in which like the Ztna solution almost becomes an IDP itself. Like I have this dream I'm trying to pitch our product team and our design team, where you would be able to use the Twingate identity, right, the roles you're assigned in Twingate, to then directly authenticate without you having to do any work into stuff you use in your home lab. Maybe you log into a Home Assistant without actually logging in. But because you have access to the right resource as per your security model in Twingate, then Twingate knows it intercepts your connection, boom, it logs you into Home Assistant, right? So like from a user's experience perspective, it's amazing because one less login. Who wants to have to log into every single thing you host in your home lab? I don't want to have to log into everything, but I still do, because most platforms actually mandate that, right? So if you could tie the permissions and identity defined in your ZTNA solution to all of those solutions, amazing user experience and just the same security controls, or the same security model. I would love if we could build something like that.
Yes.
Right.
I absolutely love these conversations. They cause my mind to wander just a little bit as talking, and I have some of the greatest, most weird thoughts. Like Demolition Man was a great movie, and it took place in 2032.
Is that the year? Okay.
And all they had were silly biometrics. You had Wesley Snipes take the guy's eye out and put it up to the camera.
That's right.
If they had ZTNA, Demolition Man would have never happened. We wouldn't have had the fast food franchise wars of 2032. But all joking aside, I think that there is an interesting level of sophistication with regards to authentication mechanisms and systems and methodologies now that we have gone past having that perimeter. And yes, the demolition man analogy is completely ridiculous, but there is a certain amount of wonder to it, wonder that comes from it. Just like Tom was explaining about the gentleman that went through a year of relearning before doing a presentation. There's a certain amount of discovery and wonder that comes from doing that work. And it's something that should be applauded. So I have no idea who you were that did that work for that year-long thing for the presentation, but I applaud you. That's exactly what we need. That's where innovation comes from. And that's why we're having the kind of conversation that we're having today.
Well, and one more thing I want to go back and touch on. This was a topic that's come up a lot, and it came up in a live stream I was doing last Saturday with my friend who's an expert on CIS controls. So he gave his talk at RSA on that topic. So he made the stage. But the identity providers is part of your controls of something you need. You need to have centralized management. But where people get this wrong, and I'm glad because some of it was marketing by some of these other companies who didn't do it well. Control plane, as in things that are mission critical, things that control your servers, things to control your backup, etc., should not be the same identity provider as where you're delegating users. You should have a clear separation. Now, Veeam just released the other day that they had a security problem that they found, and it turns out tying Veeam over to your Active Directory allowed users, not domain admin users, but any
standard users
to be able to pivot into Veeam and control backups. They found a way to privilege escalate that. But Veeam, now what they recommend today is not what they recommended before. They have this feature to tie to Active Directory. But the goal was they wanted you to tie it together all the time. Now they've updated their documentation over the last couple of years to say, no, if you do want to tie it to it, you should have a separate, like, administrative control plane identity provider versus where the users are. So you have this separation. And this is not really new. Microsoft's been preaching that for a very long time. And always it was the joke at Microsoft. Well, they want to sell you two instances of Azure or two instances of Active Directory, which makes it prohibitive. But when you talk about self-hosted one, that's something you can take into consideration. Self-hosted one for users. Maybe you don't do this in a home lab other than for funsies. But from a user standpoint, because we couldn't manage the volume of users my company manages if we didn't have some type of IDP and privilege solution for them. But you got to keep that other part separate for the control plane. And it's just some food for thought for people that think, well, I'll tie it all together in one login for all the things. Well, your administrator logins that control things like your backups or even the ability to create API keys should not be the same IDP that just general users use.
Quite often technology mimics other things that happen in life, right? Why not look at this as front of house and back of house? Yeah. Those are two separate groups that operate within a business with a common goal, but have very different functions. It's like back end and front end of an application. You can treat them separately. Hell, applications can be headless, and your front end can be sitting in a completely different data center, a different machine, secured in a completely different way, different language, but they work together. And I think it's very similar to that. Gosh, you know what? We've been here for an hour, and that went by like I was waiting for a microwave burrito to finish. I was waiting for the 5 beeps to hear from the kitchen. That was fast. Is there anything that we haven't covered so far that you guys want to jump into as we begin to close up this the Q&A?
Oh, we covered quite the topics here.
We covered a lot of topics, and we also had one thing we didn't do, and I'm very, very proud of the three of us. We went overkill in some areas, but we did not go overkill on acronyms.
Yeah, that's true.
I just realized that, and that's a beautiful thing. Acronyms can lead to confusion.
This is something that Brendan can address pretty easily. In traditional VPN, as your marketing says, VPN sucks. The scalability, I start with my company. I really want to grow, and we hit the jackpot. We go from 10 users to 1,000 users.
Yeah.
Overlay style VPN scales very differently than there because
for sure.
when you think about the concentration of narrowing down to one VPN and out, I got to keep buying a box because insert name of your favorite VPN or firewall that has a VPN built in, there's a number next to it. It supports 10 users, 20 users, X number of users. So you keep buying a bigger box as you add more people. But you have a very different scaling system when you think about with a zero trust and something like Twingate.
You can't work with a vendor that's going to charge you as you scale in that way. Like if it gets in the way of your scale, it gets in the way of how you do business, basically, right? So it kind of deteriorates your ability to provide value fast to your own customers. And the equivalence, like, it's not really that, but the remote equivalent to anything remotely close to a VPN gateway in the Twingate world, so call it connector. Really small piece of software, fits in a container, fits in a small VM. You can spin those up and down using automation, like Terraform, Ansible, Pulumi, or APIs, you name it. To the point that we have, like, I think one of our largest customers ends up having between 600 and 700 of those, only because it's a very large video game studio, and they're very, as in traditionally video game studios are very segmented because they have sub studios, and so they work in completely independent ways. So every team is responsible for their own environment, and spinning up and down the infrastructure related to remote access gets done as part of continuous integration, continuous delivery. This is the solutions that you have to invest in, because you have to bake your security. Your security model is no longer static. It's no longer a thing that you do once and then you kind of leave it alone. It has to be parts and weaved into the fabric of everything you change constantly, because that's what your business does to grow. So if you're going to constantly release software, create new environments, tear down old environments, the paradigm, the security paradigm, and the underlying infrastructure has to be in that, and therefore automation has to be an intricate part of its fabric, right? Like, that's how it's got. And pricing should be completely decoupled from that. You shouldn't require to build and buy bigger boxes. You should let customers do whatever they need to do as part of their existing processes without intruding, without slowing them down. That's how you should help and assist your customers scale up, not get in their way. In the same way that you want to provide a solution as an IT team that's not going to get in the way of your end users. You don't want to have pissed off end users, right? That's you and your job, and then you have to deal with IT tickets. You want to be proactive and you want to be efficient. That's the way to scale.
Yeah. It's also the elastic side of it, where some companies are non-traditional. They're seasonal almost. They work on a project, but then they have lulls where they don't need it. So always having to have this large piece of hardware that's your expensive firewall to be able to handle that many VPN users, it doesn't have the same ROI or cost effectiveness, because you're like, it's just not used this many times. We can't just spin down or scale down easily. So there's a lot better ways to do it, and Ztna and Twingate's a much better way to solve that problem of scaling and users.
Boy,
it's easier.
Okay, talked firewalls. One last question, not even related to this stuff. I'm just curious, and I think that people find it interesting too. Do either of you remember the first firewall you had?
Oh man, I mean, the first firewall I ever had was just embedded in a Synology router. When Synology started making routers after they've been making NASs for a long time, but they released a router. And I love their technology. I don't like what they're doing with hard drives, to be honest, but back then the technology was really robust. It still is. It works well for me. The first router had a firewall embedded in it, and I just used that. Since then, I moved to something a bit more sophisticated, but not that sophisticated, that I love, which is a Firewalla. I've loved working with Firewalla. I've actually invested in their access points more recently as well. It does the micro-segmentation and virtual quarantine. That's beautiful, easy to configure. That's what it was for me.
Very nice, very nice. Tom, how many? You've probably had so many firewalls. This might be a hard one, but
I have. I mean, in the corporate world, it was the Cisco ASAs, but I quickly moved over to. It's a forked project. It's called IP Fire now. I don't think it's very actively developed, but it was called IP Cop.
Yes,
in 2001. So,
oh my, Zone Alarm, IP Cop. They were handled back then.
Yeah, it was called IP Cop. It's funny. If you go to Wikipedia, there's a history of open source firewalls. So I used to run Mandrake, had one as well. The Mandrake one had a weird name, but I mostly used the Mandrake for their integration of what's that tool called? Squid proxy. So I had a Mandrake as a Squid proxy for caching, because we had a fractional T1 in 2000. So that was what handled that side of it. And then I used the IP cop for the other side. They didn't have it at the time. I don't remember if it ever got there, but didn't have Squid proxy in it at the time. That's why we had Mandrake running Squid for caching. We had a large transportation company I was doing IT for, and everyone checked the weather at the same time. And it turned out when you're on a fractional P1, weather's important. But when everyone's there was 40 users in the office and they started checking the weather at the same time, turns out that was bad for the fractional
That's
P1.
right, the channels, man.
So, but
Was-
we could cache all the assets. So it was amazing how much faster it made it and reduced our bandwidth. But yeah, my early days were some of the most setting up very rudimentary things and mostly driven by solving a problem. There was no product people to sell us these things. There wasn't anyone productizing Squid. It was somebody's project. And you would get on the IRC channels and just talk to the developers and start learning how to implement. Like people ask like how this stuff got installed. I'm like, I was hanging out with developers in IRC channels. What are you talking about? Like that's how we did things in the early 2000s.
I feel like you were probably in one channel on like an FNet server learning about that, and I was on a Dalnet server learning about Varnish. You know, it's the same thing.
So that's how I got into just some of the open source firewalls and things like that over the past 25 years. Is I literally used them in the company I worked for was doing close to $40 million a year in business. They were not a small company, and that's in 2000 money. So
$2,000.
I'm scaling over 25 years because inflation, but it was a good sized company, and we had problems that needed to be solved. And so I was solving them. Like
that's amazing. Squid proxy and gas was 99 cents a gallon.
That was true too. I guess it just broke in $1 because in the 90s it just got, I was like $1.05 or $1.09 a gallon back then.
Just got my license. Those numbers are burned up here. And speaking of numbers, my first firewall was a 3Com SuperStack 3. And that was ancient. It was a couple of years before 3Com started closing up shop. And I've never looked into it, but I have a funny feeling that some of the SuperStack's DNA ended up in SonicWall. Because the pre-SonicWall Advanced, remember when they had like Advanced and the Standard years ago? The Standard version was almost identical in UI to the SuperStack 3.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think they had frameworks for UIs back then the same way.
Sonic bought their stack from
maybe
the company they bought them from. Yes, but the company specifically builds it. I won't get down that rabbit hole, but if you look at one of the vulnerabilities that was probably from 3 or 4 years ago from SonicWall, it didn't stem directly from SonicWall. It was a problem they found in a TCP/IP stack, which led me to learning because first they found a flaw in this company. I think the company's in Ohio or Indiana that sells like a base closed source stack that you bolt on. And it turns out tons of companies bought it. And the most surprising one is that their biggest customer was SonicWall.
So it really could have been that same software essentially back then. And
this company sold it to and they didn't have no one really heard about this company. They're the company you never heard of until you find out how many embedded systems use them, because they would build stuff for ARM. It's just weird. If you're not running a Linux stack, which the Linux or BSD, which is a majority of the basis for many of these things, this company was like the other company that you built from. With the exception of Cisco. Cisco is always Cisco's built their own stuff forever, but because Cisco's kind of the OG.
Cisco's an OG at the same time, and we're going to wrap this up soon. Man, I love talking about the past and tech.
Oh, it's fun.
There was, I had purchased the first Barracuda mail filter appliance. I have a t-shirt still, and it actually says "Eat More Spam" on it, and it says spam, email, and instant message firewalls or something along the lines. It's beautifully terrible marketing. I am firewalls. Come on, people, please. Not anymore. Not in 2025. But guys, it's been great to have this chat today. I think QAs are always helpful. I love it when they're as casual as they are. We're going to make sure this gets out to as many people as possible because the questions around ZTNA are constant. I get them quite often, and I usually defer people to other places. And now we can defer them to this, which is a beautiful thing. Got a little start of authority on this guy.
Yep.
So with that said, anything you guys want to say before I go ahead and hit the end stream button?
Only if you're interested in experimenting with ZTNA, even if you're not super technical, just pop to our subreddit and go and ask all the questions you want. Don't be afraid that if you're not super technical and you don't know networking very well, it's okay. Right? That's what we're here for. I think my team and I love nothing more than to explain things to other people. I think that's what we hire for, that skill. It's free, check it out, and that's it. And I'm always happy to learn also there's always something to learn from people's own environments and constraints. So come educate us as well and kind of dictate and influence the future of our product, especially as AI rises to us all and becomes both a productivity tool and something that will be undoubtedly exploited as well. I'd love to learn from you all as well. That's it.
That's a beautiful community statement right there. Tom, you got anything?
No, much the same. Head over. People give Reddit. I'll preface this. I hear people kind of give, "Oh, Reddit's full of stunk." I'm like, I'm sure if you are in the general Reddits arguing about whatever topic or hot take someone had in screenshot that they shared from some social site, yeah, that's a terrible part of Reddit. The networking side of Reddit or the Twingate side, the niche side pieces of Reddit, and I call them niche because they're not as popular as cat pictures, but but those areas have a lot of good community. I engage with the community there myself. You'll find a lot of learning you can do there. So yeah, much the same. It's the same reason I even run my own forums, is because I want to engage with community on places. There are plenty of good places on the internet. Just kind of ignore whatever hot takes someone has and social stuff, and it's usually not that interesting anyways what they have to say. Don't get distracted by the cat pictures or the stupid hot takes. The enraged engagement stuff. So spend some time on networking. Just get your own enragement while you learn it. But
Beautiful.
Once it all clicks, everyone says that like VLANs are one of those things that it doesn't work in your head until you go, oh wait, you'll find that one person explained it in a way that made a whole lot of sense to you.
Exactly.
And you got to get out in there into those spaces in order to make those connections and have those conversations. Now I'm going to end with one last thing, because the color of your shirt's pretty familiar. I have a high degree of familiarity over shirts from the Lawrence System shop. Are you wearing a Lawrence System shirt? Oh, he is. I had a funny feeling it was a Raid shirt.
Raid is not a backup.
Raid is never a backup.
Raid is not a backup, and untested backups are just wishful thinking. Go test your backups and we're out of here.
That was the most beautiful way to end this, guys. So everyone out there, enjoy the rest of your day and come back and watch the recording. I think it's going to be a good watch. It definitely is. So with that said, take care of yourselves. We'll talk to you soon.